Good afternoon. This is Rebecca Martin. I am the Executive Director of NASH, and I am very happy to be here today to welcome you to our webinar on high impact practices and student learning gains. This is part of the work of taking student success to scale. And Chrissy, if you could go to the next slide. As many of you know, we have had a network focused on student success at NASH for the last 7 years. When we began, we selected interventions that were chosen based on having an evidence base, improving student outcomes, and closing equity gaps. And we designed an initiative that allowed for flexible implementation around these 3 student success interventions: redesigning the math pathway, guided pathways using predictive analytics, and then the one we're going to talk about today, high impact practices for all students. We wanted to give systems and their campuses the opportunity to come together and work across a network and learn from one another as they moved forward with implementing these strategies. But we didn't tell people what to do or how to do it. We just all came together around these goals. We also wanted to create a common set of definitions for success and minimum thresholds for adoption and diffusion. And so this is a kind of a follow-on on the high impact practices strand of the work. And let me mention to you, we have many people on the line today, so we know we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions, but as we move through this, if you would put your questions in the chat, we would be very happy to try and answer as many as we can. Next slide, please. So in 2017, we received a very generous grant from Lumina Foundation to support 4 systems and 22 of their campuses to really go deep on the high impact practices part of this initiative. Those systems are the University System of Georgia, Montana University System, the Tennessee Board of Regents, and the University of Wisconsin System. And what we did with these 4 systems was work to identify high quality practices. We were very interested in understanding about the role of quality in high impact practices, as well as about the role of equity. So quality and equity were kind of our twin areas of focus as we did this work. We worked on coding, in some cases on coding courses so that we could track students and understand how these HIPs worked for them. And then we shared definitions and measures across the network. Next slide. So the system collaboration, which was really at the heart of this work, was focused on demonstrating the impact of a scaled approach coordinated by the system to student success, including the integration with faculty, with curriculum, and with learning outcomes. We were very interested in the access and impact of these innovations for students from underserved communities and for low-income students, because closing equity gaps has been from the beginning one of the primary goals for the taking student success to scale. We were also interested in developing approaches to data collection and assessment for HIPs and for pathways, with particular attention to student learning focus on inclusion of outcomes for students, as I mentioned earlier, from underserved communities. We also worked to identify and advance promising HIPs models at both the system and the campus levels. Next slide. So you can find a lot about what we learned during this initiative in our online modules on high impact practice and educator's guide. You can hear directly through videos from the people who were engaged in the project. You can see many tools that you could use, take back and use yourselves in your own environment. So this is, you can find the modules at this website, but you can also just go to the NASH website and you will find it right there on our homepage and be able to learn more about the initiative itself. But what we're going to do today is to hear from both our funder and the external evaluator that developed the data to assess the impact of the work that we did together with these 4 systems. And so I'm really pleased right now to introduce our 2 panelists, Debra Humphreys from the Lumina Foundation. And without Debra and her confidence in NASH to do this work, we wouldn't be sitting here today. And then Derek Price from DVP-PRAXIS, who I mentioned, serves as the external evaluator for the project. And he has a lot of really interesting data to share with you. So with that, let me turn it over to Debra.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm really excited to be here. And I am going to be very, very brief and just say a little bit about why I and Lumina were so excited to partner with NASH and with Rebecca and her team on this project, and also with Derek and his team. And I'll just say a little bit about our interest in the project, my own background, and some of the assumptions that I and Rebecca had going in, and then we'll turn it over to Derek, who can share some really interesting data on what these systems did and what kind of impact it had on some of our goals. So we can go to the next slide. And I'll just say a little bit about both Lumina Foundation and myself. So as Rebecca mentioned, I am at the Lumina Foundation, which I think most of you know is an independent private foundation, national in scope, but located in Indianapolis. I've been at the foundation for about 4.5 years, and I oversee right now 2 different portfolios of work. One, our work on strategic communications, trying to ensure that the larger environment is such that people can understand the goals that we're trying to reach and support them. And then also a portfolio working on increasing bachelor's degree attainment and closing racial equity gaps in doing that. Relevant to this project, however, I do want to say that before I came to Lumina Foundation, I spent several decades at the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and that was where I first met Rebecca, way back when she was at the University of Wisconsin system. And over those 20 years, I worked on a lot of different projects related to faculty and curriculum development, largely around issues of diversity and equity. And I also was involved in the leadership team for the LEAP initiative, which was one of the initiatives that began to explore this concept of more engaged learning practices and having impact on all the different kinds of student outcomes. And so I was really excited when I came to Lumina Foundation and reconnected with Rebecca, and had been following for a long time the Taking Student Success to Scale initiative. And I was very, very interested in it. And in particular, this part of the high impact practices. And I'll say a little bit later about the assumptions that I had and why I wanted to focus our work at Lumina on that part of the project. But let me just say some broad things about Lumina Foundation for those of you who may not know much about us. We are a foundation that is somewhat unusual in philanthropy in that we have only one area of focus. So our entire portfolio of work is about learning beyond high school. And we've organized our work for quite some time around a very specific goal, which is that we believe that at least 60% of Americans should have high quality credentials beyond high school by 2025. And therefore we organize all of our work to try to advance that goal. Now you can go to the next slide. Now, one of the things that you'll notice in that goal is we use the term high quality. And that is incredibly important to Lumina and to me, and is connected to our commitment to equity. We released a new strategic plan just recently at the end of 2019. And you'll see this quote from it that helps you see how we think about the goal. The goal is a numerical goal, but ultimately, it isn't really the number that matters. It's whether those credentials that we're trying to enable more people to have access to really open up opportunity. And we know that will not happen unless those credentials are of high quality and unless we create the systems necessary for all students from all different kinds of backgrounds to have the high quality learning experiences that result in that opening up of opportunity. So if you go to the next slide. So we, as Rebecca mentioned, we funded this project in 2017. Later in 2018, we actually put together a task force on quality credentials to try to get even more specific about defining what quality credentials really are, what are the dimensions of them, what do you have to look at to really say, yes, you have a quality credential and a quality program leading to that credential. And one of the things that we really hammered home on in that work with the task force, which released its report, Unlocking the Nation's Potential, in late 2019, was this intersection of commitments of quality and equity. And we were, the project and some of the dimensions of quality that are detailed in that report were really influenced in some ways by what we were learning in the NASH initiative and other initiatives that really try to work on these issues in tandem, not working separately on issues of equity in completion and then on a separate track, quality of student learning, and bringing those things together. So you'll go to my last slide. I think this is my last slide, and then I'm going to turn it over for the real meat of this presentation. I wanted to, however, put on the table some of the hypotheses that both Rebecca and I had in trying to pull together this project and to fund it. We can talk in the Q&A section about what you think of these hypotheses and whether in the project itself we felt like they came to fruition. I would say it's sort of would be my assessment of my own hypotheses. One of the things that we knew, Rebecca and I knew, that many institutions had been working for quite a long time on this concept of more engaged learning practices and how we can ensure that more people have access to them. And we felt like the movement to bring the practices to scale had reached a level of sophistication that was sort of high enough that you could then build out systemic approaches to defining quality in terms of implementation, and then being able to track results and impact at the institutional and system levels. We also knew that the research base for all of this was pretty solid on most of the high impact practices, and it suggested this positive impact of participation generally. But we also knew there was great variation in the quality of implementation and the intentionality of design of these practices. And one of the things we also felt was that there was a misalignment between how many of these practices were intentionally designed and the actual needs of who today's students are, and especially to our equity goals. So we had a suspicion that the practices might be having a differential impact, not just in who had access to them, but to how they were designed to enable students to really get the most out of them. So that was also a hypothesis. And the third hypothesis was that for many years, many people on college campuses were working on multiple aspects of student success. There was a focus on getting more students to be retained and completed in a timely manner, the sort of what has come to be known as the completion agenda. Then there was all this work on high impact learning strategies. There was work on learning outcomes and how we assessed those. And I felt like at this moment in 2017, we were actually beyond the moment where we needed to connect all of these efforts around student success and enable a kind of integrated, equity-minded student success agenda that looked at not only whether students were making adequate progress towards the finish line, but what their experiences were in teaching and learning along the way to assure that we were accomplishing both goals at once. We were actually getting more students to the finish line, and we were assuring that they were having quality experiences and quality outcomes once they reached the finish line. So these were the three guiding principles behind the design of the project. And I was very, very pleased to have the opportunity to work with Derek Price, who, as Rebecca mentioned, is the principal and founder of DVP-PRAXIS. Derek has years and years of experience working actually both on evaluation, but also on sort of strategic planning and implementation projects related to student success in higher education. So it was a great privilege for me to have this opportunity to work with Derek, who is not just a really good researcher and an evaluator, but is a very creative person, and therefore was able to deal with the complexities of this project and produce several reports at the end of it which he'll talk a little bit about, that gave us a really interesting picture of what these systems were able to accomplish. So I'll turn it over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Deborah. That was a very kind and generous introduction, and thanks for that. And thank you, Rebecca, for inviting myself and Deborah to be on this webinar with your group today. Chrissy, thank you for guiding the slides as well, and that's perfect. We can start right there. So one of the big sort of outcome questions that this project started with was, on the one hand, could this sort of scaled systemic approach with intentionality of design help increase participation in high impact practices during the initiative, particularly for African American, Hispanic, and American Indian student populations? And then secondly to that are the outcomes, the educational outcomes of students who participate in HIPs better or different from students who did not participate in HIPs. And so we have these big overarching outcome questions that we wanted to examine. We are going to hone in on this presentation really on the second question, although I'll give you a little bit of information on the first one, but we're mostly going to hone in on the second question around the relationship between HIP participation and educational outcomes. Next slide, please. We did have a much broader evaluation. And so just to let you all know, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, I'm going to focus here on the left. We got data from the 4-year campuses within the state systems that Rebecca mentioned earlier from their participation in the National Survey of Student Engagement. And then TBR, the College System of Tennessee, actually put together an agreement with us to share administrative data. And I'll talk a little bit about that. That's our second study. So we're going to focus on that left-hand box. But we did do a number of other things too, including some in-depth site work to 8 campuses in 3 states. We really wanted to understand the efforts that the campuses were doing in those states to scale HIPs more equitably and to expand the direct measurement of student learning outcomes. And we also conducted some interviews with both system leads as well as campus leads to understand a little bit of reflective knowledge and lessons around this sort of system-driven design and process of doing this work at scale that are reflected in Deborah's assumptions. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the first question about growth in HIP participation during the initiative. And I have to tell you that including our team, like we weren't so sure we were going to see any of this because this was a fairly time delineated effort and there was a lot of things going on. And so we weren't sure, given our data sources, if we were going to see gains. But in fact, we did see gains in participation during this initiative. So we have both the self-reported student data from NESE in Georgia and Wisconsin, and we saw increasing HIP participation over time, sort of pre-post, if you will, which was driven by increases in service learning as a high impact practice. And in these systems, we also saw notable increases in participation by Hispanic and Black students, which of course was part of the equity dimension that was so important to the effort overall. And in Tennessee, the administrative data from TBR also showed gains in HIP participation during this initiative, particularly in the first year experience, in technology-enabled learning, and in service learning participation. So across both states, you can see, and we'll come back to this theme, that service learning, there were gains in that particular high-impact practice, and of course, that is a widely experienced practice nationally among students. Next slide, please. So let's start with study 1. So the first study I'm going to talk to you about is using the NESE data from Georgia, Wisconsin, and Montana. There were 15 institutions in those 3 systems that were part of this particular data analysis thing. It covered 28,000 students across multiple survey administrations between 2014 and 2020. And here we just wanted to sort of engage with sort of the research literature on this question of HIP participation and self-reported learning gains. And the sort of twist that we put on this is we really wanted to dig in deeply on the impacts for Black and Hispanic students and for adult students 25 and older, which of course is a top priority for the Lumina Foundation to address adult learners in this effort. And so this was the study 1 on learning gains. And we wanted to build on prior research here. And as Rebecca and I think Deborah both mentioned, there is some solid literature on the relationship between HIP participation and learning gains, sort of self-reported learning, if you will. And we wanted to see if, in fact, in this system, if we could also document that, particularly disaggregated by various student groups. And as you'll see in a moment, we also tried to dig down to the specific high impact practice level and see what we could learn there about potential variation among different groups of students. Next slide, please. So one of the first things that we did as we thought about this analysis is we sort of created our own categorization of HIPs. NESE, as many of you know, perhaps all of you on the call, they asked in their survey about student participation in 6 high impact practices. They're listed here on the screen for you. And we broke those 6 into sort of 2 groups, something we call them meta HIPs, if you will, sort of campus-based HIPs, which really are focused on work that's happening in essence on the campus primarily. It might have off-campus or broader community impacts or aspects of it, but it really is about the campus itself. You're doing work on the campus itself. And then community-based HIPs, which really are about getting outside of the campus, learning beyond the classroom, if you will, beyond the campus setting. So we grouped these into 2 different types of high impact practices. We call them meta HIPs, campus-based and community-based. And we began to analyze the data in this way, which we thought was a contribution to the literature a little bit differently than what people had seen before. Next slide, please. So if we look at participation in HIPs, breaking it down by campus and community-based, again, this is NESE survey data, you can see that there's wide participation. If we look at any one HIP at all, actually about 2/3 of students participated in a community-based HIP, and more than 40% of students participated in campus-based HIPs. There is variation by the high impact practice, of course. You can see that in the chart on your left, which also breaks it down by various groups of students. So the lightest bar at the top, just to orient you to the slide and subsequent slides, the lightest bar at the top are adult students age 25 and older in this particular sample. The next bar, sort of the slightly darker bar or light colored bar, is Hispanic students. The medium colored bar are Black students. And then the bottom bar, the darkest colored bar, is all of the students in our sample. And when we look at the overall participation rate and sort of break that down by specific types of high impact practices, you can see the variation on the slide itself, with things like service learning being widely experienced by all sorts of different students and fairly common. Not a lot of variation there, slightly lower for adults. But then when you look at some of the other high impact practices, you do see, in fact, difference in experience based on whether they're an adult and based on whether they're Black or Hispanic student, for example, which is what we wanted to explore. In particular, you can see that Black and Hispanic students have slightly higher participation in service learning compared to the full sample, but they're less likely to participate in internships, for example, just to give you a little flavor of this. Service learning, as we've indicated, is by far the most common high impact practice experienced, and it's experienced even at slightly higher rates for Black and Hispanic students relative to the overall sample, but at slightly lower rates for students 25 and older. But across the board, this is the most common high impact practice for this sample. And that's actually consistent with the national data from NESE. So nothing really new here in terms of service learning being such a significant component here. I do want to point out one other slide here. And even though the overall participation down below, you'll see under undergraduate research is much lower. Study abroad is the only one that has a lower participation. But research with faculty has a fairly low participation rate across the board, and it's even slightly lower for Black and Hispanic students as well. And that's an area we're going to come back to a little bit more in the study. Next slide, please. So one of the things we also did is we wanted to categorize the learning gains. NESE asked respondents to sort of assess the extent to which their college experience contributed to their knowledge, skills, and personal development in a variety of domains. There are 10 questions that they asked in this way. And we wanted to see if, in fact, all of these gains sort of, in essence, we did a factor analysis, I guess is what I should tell you, to see to group these various learning gains together. And so the 4 gains on the top bar here sort of were factored and loaded together as sort of a similarity in terms of gains. And the bottom 6 domains also loaded together, conducting this factor analysis. And these nicely sort of aligned in our mind as sort of distinguishing between what you might consider academic type learning gains and practical learning gains. So things that might help you really do well, certainly in the classroom, things that lots of courses want students to become proficient, if not master, in their course, or at least through their undergraduate curriculum. And then the practical learning gains, which might be things also important in the classroom, but have great practical value when one transitions out of their undergraduate experience, perhaps into the workforce. So we were pretty pleased to see these 10 domains sort of load in the way that we did. And we were then able to conduct analysis moving forward, looking at overall learning gains, looking at all 10 of these domains, but then also looking at academic learning gains and practical learning gains in a distinction. And these, again, are all self-reported data from the National Survey of Student Engagement. Next slide, please. So the first question is, do HIP participation, does it improve educational outcomes? And across the board here, the answer is yes, it does. Right. So what basically we're looking at here is the full sample of over 28,000 students across survey administrations between 2014 and 2020. And all of these bars that you see here are significantly, statistically significant differences at a 0.10 or better level of significance. And what we're looking at here is the self-reported learning gains for a student who participated in a HIP compared to a student who did not participate in a HIP. And so this is a HIP versus no HIP type of comparison. The left-hand bar is the overall gains, looking at all 10 of those domains together. And then we've broken out those domains. The sort of darker colored bar in the middle is academic gains. Those are the 4 learning domains that we mentioned earlier. And the far right-hand side is the practical learning gains. That's the group of 6 domains that we mentioned earlier. And you can see that across the board, they're all positively associated with these outcomes. Now, I should tell you that these, the data, the point that you see on here are basically coefficients from regression analysis, in which we regress the learning gain outcomes, the 3 groups that I just mentioned, on a number of various factors like race and ethnicity and demography and things of that sort that are important that we had data on, either in this case reported from NESI. And so we're controlling for some of those things like race and ethnicity, gender, age. It's NESI, so they have freshmen and seniors that take this survey. For example, they have data on first generation and transfer status, for example, and we used all of those data in our regression analyses. Now, what we did also on these scales is we standardized them. So what we're basically looking at is that participation in a HIP was standardized as basically a 0 with a standard deviation of 1. And so we're trying to get at something that we can look at across various models in a standardized way to make sense of them. And what you're looking at here in terms of the actual coefficients are actually portions of a standard deviation. So for example, looking at the community-based HIP group on the left and looking at the far right or the medium colored bar, that coefficient is 0.36. And what this means is that a student who was in a community-based HIP, participated in a community-based HIP, had an average learning gain score of 0.36 of a standard deviation units higher than the average score of a student that was not in a learning, not in a high impact practices. So these are standard deviation units, if you will. And we're looking at HIPs versus no HIPs. Another way to think about this, if you wanted to sort of simplify it in your mind just for interpretive reasons, is you've got about a 1/3 or a 36% higher average mean for participating in a HIP on learning gains versus the group of students that didn't participate. So it's about a 1/3 higher. So these are relatively large, at least 0.36 is. And generally in the research literature, although it's changing, but historically, scholars that use this methodology and use standard deviation units have talked about a unit of 0.20 or higher as being a meaningful difference. And you can see that virtually all of our coefficients here are at 0.2 or higher. We only have one that's that 0.19. However, more recent literature has started to say, well, that might be not as important. The magnitude may not be as important. What's important is that these are statistically significant. So there is some debate in the scholarly literature about this, but it doesn't matter for our purposes which way we go here, because virtually all of our outcomes have a 0.20 standard deviation impact or higher, and they're all statistically significant. So we feel pretty good about the overall results here. Now you can see in this chart that participation in community-based HIPs seem to generate a slightly higher self-reported learning gain than participation in a campus-based HIP. We don't quite know why that might be the case, but it is something worth further exploration of why in fact that might be the case. We also can look at this notion of the difference between, say, the academic learning gains and the practical learning gains. So among campus-based HIPs, they're fairly comparable. No real difference in terms of the impact, 0.20, 0.19, with the overall of 0.21. But if we look at the community-based HIPs, we find that they actually have a much larger self-reported impact on practical gains than they do on academic gains. However, both of those are larger than the gains from campus-based HIPs that generates a much higher overall learning gain participation here. So this is just an interesting set of data to just document that, like the existing research literature, there does seem to be quite a positive relationship between student participation in HIP, including in our meta-HIP categories, both in overall learning gains, academic learning gains, and practical learning gains. Next slide, please. We wanted to break this down as well by particular HIPs to see if we see the same kinds of patterns here. And so, as I mentioned before, community-based HIPs correlate more strongly with practical learning gains, and campus-based HIPs, particularly research with faculty and capstone, correlate more strongly with academic gains. However, the learning community on a campus-based HIP is actually correlated with bigger practical gains. So some interesting dynamics here about the type of HIP and its potential relationship with the various learning gains as measured by the NESI data. Now, the largest overall boost to gains, both practical and academic, is seen for service learning. And this is important because this is actually the most widely utilized or most widely experienced high impact practice in this sample and nationally, according to NESI data. So the good news is that is a very good practice in terms of students reporting positive academic and practical learning gains who have participated in service learning. On the other hand, I want to bring back the research with faculty on the far left-hand side of this chart. And there are a couple of things of note here. The first is that for academic learning gains, that's quite a large standard deviation unit, 0.23, positive impact for academic learning gains, but not less so on the practical learning gain for participation in undergraduate research. So we don't have an answer or explanation for why that difference might be the case, but this is of interest if we wanted to unpack the value in high impact practice in a little bit more detailed way for future research. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned, this was a big equity push, so we wanted to look at these data by various groups of students, and the three groups of students that we looked at were Hispanic students, Black students, and adult students 25 and older. And the data that you see here shows for community-based HIPs, shows the, again, standard deviation impact units, and you can see above at the top level, that's what we saw for overall. So you can look at the overall if you want to make a comparison there. The important thing to say here is that learning gains for Black and Hispanic students that engage in community-based HIPs are quite large, and they're driven by really large returns for service learning. It's a pretty, we don't show that on this particular chart, but the gains here for Black students are driven largely by service learning. So it may not be a surprise that the impacts on the practical gains are so high for that group of students. This slide in general for community-based HIPs reinforces findings in the literature that, that HIPs can in fact be very positive experiences for students of color. If we can get them into high quality experiences, if they're made available to them. And so this reinforces the importance of looking at this, of high impact practices from an equity point of view. I should say that Black students in particular, since I focused on that group here, also experience very nice benefits from internships. Again, not shown, that's a more detailed slide here. And Hispanic students actually benefit from study abroad. And those are benefits that don't necessarily accrue to each of those groups. So it's a very interesting notion here that for Blacks, internships seem to matter, and for Hispanics, study abroad seems to matter. And service learning matters for both students in terms of their participation in HIPS. Now, for adults 25 and older, we also saw really nice learning gains from participation in community-based HIPS. And this was true for service learning and internships, but not for study abroad, if we wanted to break it down more specifically. There's also very limited participation in study abroad for the adult students 25 and older in this particular data set. Let's go to the next slide, please, and we'll look at the same data for campus-based HIPS. And again, we see, although the standard deviation units are slightly lower here, we do seem to see the same general pattern in terms of the value or the impact of participation in HIPS. And that is that Black, Hispanic students and adults, for example, 25 and older, report strong overall practical and academic learning gains from participation in campus-based HIPS. And these gains are very positive, and they're significant for Black students in particular. But for academic gains, the Black students' impact here is a little bit lower than other groups, and in part driven by a smaller reported gain from undergraduate research. So you remember early on, we talked about undergraduate research being a very positive, high impact practice for academic learning gains. In general, it was one of the largest impacts that we saw in these regression analyses. But we're not seeing the same positive impact for Black students. It is positive, but it's much lower. And so there's a question here that's raised, and one that I think the research literature has already raised, which is about the experience Black students have as undergraduates with their faculty and how that could maybe be improved from an equitable position, because we know how important this particular learning gain is. Participation in general is lower for research with faculty, but we'd like to get the gains to be at least equivalent for all students that do experience research with faculty, for example. So it's an area that might require some additional research. A lot of data I'm throwing at you, and I have another study I want to share with you as well. So I'm going to go to the next slide and just summarize what we learned from this first study. And that is reinforcing a lot of the literature you guys already know, which is that HIP participation is strongly associated with students' academic and practical learning gains as reported by the NESI data. And this is true for all students, but also true for Black students, for Hispanic students, and students aged 25 and older. In other words, it's not a high impact practice for only some students. It's a high impact practices for all the students that we looked at, even though the relative gains might be slightly different. The gains were there for all of these groups of students across most of the high impact practices. Service learning is indeed the most common high impact practice experience by our sample, and it's associated with the largest boost to learning gains, and especially for adults 25 and older. So that's a very important finding if we're interested in serving the adult population better at our institutions. And then the final takeaway is that research with faculty does confer strong academic learning gains, but those benefits are not experienced equitably by Black students who have research with undergraduate research as a high impact practices. And in fact, they're one of the least likely groups to experience that high impact practice in the first place. So there's an area where perhaps practitioners and faculty leaders can work harder and find innovative ways to better serve Black students at their institutions to experience undergraduate research. We did find that community-based HIPS are stronger boosts compared to campus-based HIPS. I'm not sure how important that distinction really is. It was interesting to create that meta-narrative or that meta-category to sort of look at the data in a different way. But at the end of the day, a high-impact practice, whether it be community-based or campus-based, which really is just our organizational categorization, I'm not sure how important that is. Maybe there's more to learn there, or maybe that's just a category that's of interest and there's not much more to explore. But they are significant for all students, as I mentioned before. All right, I'm going to keep going. Thank you very much. So our second study is focused on TBR. This is a 2-year system in Tennessee, and there were 5 institutions that participated in the project there. And so we have, these are institutions that were at least largely selected because they had high enrollments of students of color, and they were selected to be a part of the initiative for that reason. And then secondly, within the institutions, they selected pathways within their colleges that also had high enrollments of students of color. So the intentionality here is important, and that's going to come back later as we talk about system-driven change. Tennessee was also in a relatively advanced status among all of the campuses here because they had been working on developing high impact practice taxonomies for a number of years prior to this initiative, in which they got agreed upon standard thresholds for practice. This is how I think when Deborah's talking about quality and Rebecca's talking about quality, this is the way that the system was trying to gather that whatever high impact practices was being delivered among their campuses, that it met some quality thresholds. And so they created these taxonomies that were faculty informed and led and sort of to buy in that these were the minimum thresholds in order to then count that somebody participated in a high impact practice. In fact, that's another area where Tennessee was sort of ahead of the game among these four systems. And that is they had been developing a standardized coding process within their administrative records to know whether a student at their colleges had participated in a high impact practices across all their campuses. So on the one hand, they were setting quality standards and thresholds. And on the other hand, they were saying, and if you meet that threshold, you report it in our system in this way, and that enabled them to systematically follow that information over time. So in this particular study, we were able to get these data from the system and analyze participation in high impact practices and look at various shorter term momentum metrics or educational outcomes. So now we're shifting from self-reported learning gains as our outcome to administrative record educational progress gains moving forward, such as retention, such as credit milestones within a particular period of time, such as completion of gateway math or gateway English courses along a pathway. Next slide, please. So among the various high impact practices that were coded in the TBR system, you can see here, similar to the NESE reported data, about 2/3 of first-time fall students in this particular sample enroll in a high impact practice in their first term. And that was the universe that we wanted to look at. Did you enroll in a high impact practice in your first term in the data? And about 2/3 of the students in Tennessee did. That was a significant gain, by the way, from the pre-NASH period. So they really expanded this work, and it was driven by the first year experience, which was becoming more and more of sort of a required aspect of the student experience in the community college setting in Tennessee, at least at these 5 institutions that we're looking at here. There were about 19,000 students in this sample, and we followed them if they enrolled in the fall of 2018 or 2019, and they had earned no more than 15 college credits as of that particular term. So these weren't all necessarily new students, but they were students with 15 or fewer credits that enrolled in the fall of 2018 and 2019. And if they participated in a HIP in that term, we grabbed them sort of as our treatment group to see what happened over time with those groups of students. You can see here that participation for Black and Hispanic students is slightly higher than for all students. And that is driven by the first year experience and the learning community courses, which often happen in the first year. And again, recognizing that these colleges, many of them were large enrollers of students of color, and they were targeting and intentionally designing high impact practices for pathways that enrolled large numbers of students. So I don't want to discount this outcome. I want to emphasize the intentionality of it and the result, which was increased participation for Black and Hispanic students overall. Now, adults 25 and older, which we looked at also in these data set, do participate at lower rates across the board, across these various high impact practices that are tracked in Tennessee. But as you'll see in a moment, they still have very positive outcomes. All right, next slide, please. So here you have a list of outcomes that we're looking at. This is a little bit easier to decipher than our learning gain standard deviation units that we showed before. These are a percentage. We're just showing you the percentages of folks that participated in a HIP versus those that didn't participate in a HIP. And we're looking at this on various outcomes like fall to spring retention or fall to fall retention. We're looking at early momentum credits for those of you in the community college space. This is data that's been advocated and pushed out by the Community College Research Center. These aren't the only momentum thresholds, but 12 credits in your first term, earning them or earning 24 credits in your first year, that should say first year. These are things to track because they're signaling that you're on the path towards success. We also looked at completion of gatekeeper math and English in this data set. And you can see across the board that participation is higher across all of these outcomes if you were in, outcomes are higher across all of them if you participated in a high impact practice. And the first year experience, and again, undergraduate research participation are associated with the largest benefits, we'll call them, but the largest differences you might see. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. We also wanted to look at this same data by race and ethnicity. And so this slide looks at Black students and Hispanic students among the 5 campuses. And here you can see the HIP versus no HIP difference. That's the black font by various outcome. And then on the far left side for each column, you can see the percentage point difference, between the two. And you can see across the board, the percentage point difference is much higher for Black students and Hispanic students who participate in the HIPs. There are 2 of those that are not statistically significant. They're for Hispanic students. They're in a lighter colored font and they're italicized. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just if you're looking at the chart trying to orient you, that's what that difference means. There are 2 values that are not statistically significant here. The important thing, though, is that across the board, participating in a HIP actually yields positive outcomes for Black and Hispanic students in this sample, whether it be retention, whether it be credit momentum, or completing gateway math and English. I do want to say that even though it doesn't show in this chart, that those percentage point gains for Black students are really large percentage gains. Oftentimes people report percentage gains. So just to give you an idea here, the fall to spring retention metric for Black students is actually that is an 8 percentage point gain. That represents a 14% increase compared to students that did not participate in the HIP. If we were looking at the fall to fall retention metric, that 8 percentage point difference actually translates to a 23% increase in fall to fall retention for Black students who participate in the HIP. Now, I'm sure there are many practitioners on the call, and that would get my attention if we saw those types of percentage differences in these outcomes. So these really are substantively meaningful differences in the outcomes that we're looking at. Now, we did do some supplementary analyses that we have not shown here about individual high impact practices rather than just any high impact practices. And I can tell you that the first year experience and the technology enhanced learning are driving the positive benefits for Black students, for example. And if we were looking at Hispanic students, we also see the first year experience and technology enhanced learning are also driving that. But in addition, Hispanic students are getting very large and consistent benefits from their participation in service learning in Tennessee. So we do start to see some differences by specific HIPs that we've tried to explore. Let's go to the next slide, which is for adults. Similar layout here. The percentage differences are the black bars, HIP or no HIP, and then there's a percentage point difference that we've shown you, and the left-hand column is for adult students. So again, you can see very large percentage point differences, and in some cases, these percentage point differences are really large percentage differences if we were to look at it that way. But these percentage point differences are indeed very meaningful, and I can tell you that digging into these data as well, that for adult students, the first year experience and a learning community are really driving these gains in the early momentum metrics that are examined in this chart. Next slide, please. So when we look at study 2, what are our big high level takeaways? Well, that high impact participation is widespread, and actually Black and Hispanic students participated at a slightly higher rate in Tennessee, at least in part, we think, because of the intentional focus for that goal by the TBR and by the participating colleges. There is a lower rate of participation by adult students. Participation for all the groups is strongly connected to improved outcomes for all sorts of these short-term academic metrics or early momentum metrics, and they're especially pronounced for Black and Hispanic students and for adults. In other words, they might even be bigger for these students in some cases. That's very important. And then lastly, the system-driven best practices here in TBR were were excellent, and they really facilitated the campus progress. They were able to engage faculty through learning communities to help them develop taxonomies and to think about the application of these high impact practices on their campuses. There were quality assessment tools that the system helped generate, again, in conjunction with faculty, to help them determine whether they were delivering a high quality practice, which was important. And of course, the system had standardized coding rules that allowed them to collect data that they felt confident really was measuring the same thing across their campuses, and then to look at those with regard to outcomes. So there is something important here about how the system and the campuses collaborated toward this way. So I'll move to my last slide, and then I'm sure there's plenty of questions that people might have about this or other things. So we think that these two studies, again, a component of the evaluation that we did on behalf of the Lumina Foundation, it really does enhance the evidence base that high impact practices improve student learning and increase students' educational progress toward credentials. So it's important validation of the research. We also believe that we've highlighted the importance of high impact practices for Black and Hispanic students and for adults 25 and older. And in some more detailed analysis, it suggests that first year experience, undergraduate research are very important for these students. Service learning has a really big impact for Hispanics, and learning communities does for adults. So the point is that the type of high impact practices that you're offering might matter for various student groups, and we should take that into account when we're designing these for our students. Studies also demonstrate that intentionality matters when you make equity a priority, and it was a priority in this effort. The TBR example I just mentioned targeted pathways and programs with high enrollment of Black and Hispanic students, and they got the outcome. Those students benefited from high impact practices, and we see that in the data. Requiring high impact practices can be an equitable aspect. So for example, the first year experience is something that many colleges were requiring, but it's important to take into account the opportunity cost and students' personal circumstances when designing and executing various high impact practices. This is something that Debra's colleague and at Lumina Foundation, Jasmine Haywood, has identified, is that you can't just assume that a high impact practice is going to be equitable from these data. You have to take into account certain circumstances. So for example, is it possible for a lower income Hispanic student to participate in an internship, even though it has great value for the student, if in fact they're also helping take care of their family and they have to work while they're in school? They may not be able to do an internship, especially if it's not paid. So you have to take those types of things into consideration, and that's the point that we're trying to convey right there. And then lastly, simply that system and institutional policy can indeed incentivize equitable HIP expansion. And I would be bemoaned if I didn't say, as a research evaluator person, that collecting and reporting data on high impact practices systematically really is an essential practice. And so we certainly are grateful for the NESI data, and that's been widely utilized in the field and will continue to be so, I imagine. But getting administrative data and getting some standards of how those data are used and how particular practices are measured really can make a difference in terms of prioritizing this type of work and expanding this work in an equitable way on college campuses. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Rebecca and Debra and the rest of the folks on the webinar.
Great, thank you so much, Derek. This is just such exciting data to see. And I have to say, you know, as you know, Derek, we were all very nervous at the beginning with an external evaluation that was going to look at 2 years of data when we know how long it takes sometimes for us to see the results. So being able to see the results so clearly, I think is really important. And we know that this work is continuing in all 4 of these systems, as well as in many other systems that watch this work with great interest and learn from it as well. I'm wondering whether, Debra, you had saw any issues or questions in the chat that you wanted to raise now?
No, I tried to answer some of the questions as we were along, and I appreciate some of you also answering questions along the way. So this is an example of fantastic little collective action effort here. There was a question about resources on the characteristics of high quality service learning. James, if you email me, dhumphreys@luminafoundation.org, I can get you some stuff on that. There's actually tons of research on, different kinds of models and what impact they have. And so it's actually an area where there's a lot of research. And then there was a question early on that I couldn't answer. I think it was for you. Let me think here. Although Carlene, I think, answered.
Well, yeah, while you're looking for that, Deborah, let me ask Carlene to unmute herself. Carlene Bandazandi was the lead in the University of Wisconsin system for this work. And I think she said a couple of really interesting things in the chat about the distinction between community-based high impact practices and campus-based high impact practices. And Carlene, I wondered if you might want to share that reflection.
Yes, in Wisconsin, we tried to map where students had access to the high impact practices across the undergraduate experience. And when I saw that categorization of the campus and the community, I couldn't help but think to go back to those maps to see, okay, what can we do as institutions or as systems to open up that access across the two different groupings? So I think that that's really important. And I wrote down access, keeping access at the center of what we do to examine our implementation. I also want to state in here not to neglect the power of well-organized professional development for our faculty to come to understand and absorb these data now that we have found out, because coming together, the quality is within the faculty and sharing their distinctions that they make about educational experiences. So now we have verified that through Derek and Jessa's analysis, and it was wonderful having them on campus. But I think the role of faculty development in making sure we get to these kind of outcomes is really, really important.
Okay. Great. So we only have just a couple minutes left. Deborah, you want to have the last word here?
Sure. I think one of the important distinctions that runs through all of this work is the distinction between required and optional, right? And I think you mentioned, Derek, that one of the things you actually saw in the TBR work, they were quite intentional about building into programs. So it's not as kind of optional, do it on the side if you want to raise your hand. They were building it into the actual pathways. Now that means that you no longer have the access problem. You actually have everybody required to do it, but you still then have a intentionality of design issue, that you have to design it so that all students can really benefit from it, right? So you have to really think through those two things. And obviously you're probably not going to have most programs with multiple HIPs required of everyone. So you're still always going to have some choice, but it does seem to me that it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me when Derek and his team thought about this sort of, let's divide these up into different categories of the more academic classroom-based stuff versus the more out in the field kind of stuff. I think that's an important distinction that we all should be thinking a lot about. Especially as we think about trying to serve adults who are already working, who are out in the field already, and then coming back into our institutions. And the more that we can kind of integrate in their own lives what they're learning out in the field, whether it's a field experience we've put them in, or whether it's a field experience that they're in because they're in a job or in some other activity. So I feel like that more applied learning and how we integrate it into our programs is a real important area for additional work.
Great, thank you. And thank all of you for joining us today for this webinar. We continue to learn about the high impact practices and their power, and we also continue to think about ways we can better utilize them to support our students. So we are ever grateful to Lumina Foundation for the confidence that they had in us at the beginning and the very important support that they made that made all of this work possible. I hope that you will take a look at the high impact practices modules on our website. There's a lot more information there that I think you will find very useful to you. and look forward to having those of you that are part of the TS3 network continue this journey with us and as we move forward. So thank you all very much. Appreciate your time. And Derek, thank you for a great presentation. Bye-bye.